can. And strangely, the center point of view of the 1860 election, all this tension building up, issues over slavery, the rebellions, everything that's been happening from 1800 to 1860 has made the South fairly paranoid. And so when Lincoln is nominated for the Republican Party for president, Southerners react with horror. They see him, because he's not committed to preserving slavery, they see him as possibly John Brown type candidate, even though he's not. He was not an abolitionist. And Lincoln's concern was preserving free soil in the West. He wanted to make sure, as many people in the North did, that there was going to be opportunity in the West, that it wasn't going to become a whole slave territory. And so that doesn't mean, though, that he was interested in ending slavery where it already existed in the South. And he very clearly said this in his speeches, in the debates. You know, he was not an abolitionist. He only wanted to preserve free soil. But Southerners saw anybody who wasn't totally committed to allowing slavery in the West as being an abolitionist. And so when he wins the election is when South Carolina and then the other deep Southern states leave the Union, before he even takes office that January. As you know, presidents get elected in November, and then they're inaugurated in January, so there's that little bit of time in between where the previous guy is still holding office. And what happens during this election is, in the Southern states, his name wasn't even allowed on the ballot, and he doesn't even carry one Southern state. I mean, his name's not on the ballot. That makes sense. And Lincoln wins the election with only 40% of the vote, so he doesn't even get the majority. He does carry every northern state, though, and this allows him to win. One of the major problems was that the Democratic Party was split into two and put forth two candidates. And so that party was obviously not going to win because people couldn't get behind one guy. So Southern Democrats had one guy, and Northern Democrats had one guy, and that meant that Lincoln was able to be elected. And so South Carolina leads the charge, and then the other deep Southern states. If you look at your map here, it'll be more clear if you look at it on black borders in color, but the deep Southern states, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, are states that seceded before the first battle, Fort Sumter. And then Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas secede after the first shots are fired in the war. And then, of course, Richmond, Virginia becomes the capital of the Confederacy. Then you've got border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and then West Virginia breaks off from Virginia, becomes its own state. Those states still hold slaves throughout the war, but stay on the side of the Union. And then all the other states, the dark color, goes on the Union side. So there's always a lot of talk and debate over this issue of secession and what are the causes of the Civil War. In my first semester I was teaching, this super right-wing friend of mine was like, "You're going to teach them why the war really happened, right?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" Because people say, "Oh, the war wasn't about slavery." And on some level, that argument is somewhat correct, because the South did have other complaints. Nevertheless, all those complaints circle around the issue of slavery. So people will say, "Oh, it's about tariffs," and tariffs are taxes that you have to pay when goods go overseas. And the South was supplying most of England's cotton needs at the time, and they had to pay pretty large tariff taxes on those. And so that was one complaint to the South, but it's a tax on products produced by slave labor, so they're connected to slavery. Another complaint is states' rights, that they wanted to have their rights to preserve slavery and expand slavery into the West. So states' rights, that still connects back to slavery. And interestingly, they didn't care when another state's rights were violated as far as retrieving fugitive slaves. So, as far as that states' rights argument, again, it takes you back to slavery. So you don't have to take my word for it. If you look on the back of that outline, you will have what's known as the cornerstone speech, or parts of it that I excerpted for you. And this is a speech given by the Vice President of the Confederacy. in which he states, this is why we're leaving the Union. So let's see what he says. He makes a speech in 1861. All right, so we'll go to the first bold line here. No citizen is deprived of life, liberty, or property. So taking out the pursuit of happiness and going back to that original 3 protected rights and making it property. Property in their case being the slaves that they held. Then the next dark section. The new Constitution, and there he's referring to the Confederate Constitution. The new Constitution has put at rest forever all but agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and President's Revolution. So there he is outright saying, this is the reason why we've separated ourselves, because we want to preserve the proper status of the Negro, African slavery. All right, skipping down a little bit, he talks about Jefferson and how Jefferson and some of the other founding fathers believed that slavery would die on its own. And he talks about the United States Constitution. The Constitution, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last, and hence no argument can be justly urged against the constitutional guarantees thus secured, because of the common sentiment of the day. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested on the assumption of the equality of the races. This was an error. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Many who hear me perhaps can recollect well that this truth was not generally admitted, even within their day. The errors of the past generation still clung to many as late as 20 years ago. Those in the North who still cling to those errors, referring to the abolitionists, with a zeal above knowledge, we justly denominate fanatics. All fanaticism springs from an aberration of the mind, from a defect in reasoning. It is a species of insanity. So if you're anti-slavery, you're insane. And the Confederate government rests upon a great moral truth, that the proper status of the Negro is to be subordinate to the superior race. And that is what they're basing their new government on. So if anyone ever says to you, Civil War wasn't started over slavery, you could say, you should read the Cornerstone speech from the Vice President of the Confederacy, in which he says, we're basing everything on slavery, and this is why we left. And if you read the documents of secession, each state that left put out their own mini Declaration of Independence, in which they say, this is why we're leaving, and we want to form a new country. And they say, because of slavery. So I'll put the links up, and just in case you're interested, you can read, it won't be on the test, but some people like to look at these. You can read South Carolina's declaration, they were the first state to leave, in which they say the same thing, basically, as he says here, that slavery is why they're leaving, and slavery is what they're basing their new society on. So the Civil War, yes, does spring from this conflict about slavery. And then later on, when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued by Lincoln, it puts that last moral part to the war in place, where in some part it was a war to free the slaves. Even though throughout the war, those border states still hold slaves. And the question of whether or not slavery would continue isn't answered until after the war. Okay, so the states, one by one, leave the Union and decide to form the Confederate States of America. And they set up a government that is, has got a weak federal government. And the state governments have much more power. And this is actually going to be bad for them during the war because it was hard to move troops and supplies from state to state when every state had its own say. And sometimes soldiers from one state would not move to another state to continue the fighting. So it was a military problem for them because they couldn't coordinate their efforts. All right, I'm just going to play a quick clip here so you can get an idea of the deep southern mindset. This is